alaikum. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the AIA's lecture tonight. Thank you for making it, and we're always honored to see everyone. We already have a full house, so I'm getting a little scared. Those who come in, I don't know what we're going to do with them, but hopefully they'll find their way through. So if you guys don't mind, if you have a bag on a chair, or if you really can scoot in, that might help those coming in sit down. I really appreciate it. The front row is okay, if people can just find their way. Great. Perfect. Okay. So, the AIA, American Institute of Architects, based in Washington, D.C., has become a leading professional membership association for licensed architects, emerging professionals, and allied partners since its inception in 1857. We have over 90,000 members worldwide. We have more than 300 chapters across the world. The AIA Middle East, established in 2010, is the biggest international chapter, actually, with more than 500 members, and growing. So we cover Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Syria, Yemen, Egypt, Algeria, and many other countries. Forgive me if I didn't mention them, but we cover the entire MENA region. We're based in Abu Dhabi, for those that are interested. Tonight's lecture, Good Arab, Bad City, on the topic of housing. Housing is a very contentious issue wherever you go in the world, because housing is directly linked to a house, a household, family, people, emotions, dreams, culture, economy. It's directly linked to our lives. I'm going to read a few excerpts from a book called The Art of Inequality, Architecture, Housing, and Real Estate by the Boyle Center. The term household is the central social unit of measurement. The US Census defines the household architecturally. A household consists of all the people who occupy a housing unit. This is directly linked to a more circumscribed definition of family. In this way, the housing market distinguishes itself from other markets. Its commodities are fixed, its rootedness in place inextricably links it to vital aspects of life beyond simply providing shelter. Its production occurs over extended periods of time and is cost intensive. And there are highly emotional values attached to it. It differs from other sectors of the real estate market through one key factor. For the overwhelming majority of people, participation is not optional. We all need a house. You don't choose to participate in housing, since the result of not participating would be homelessness. This last point creates a decided imbalance of power and choice between the providers of housing, developers or large-scale owners, and those needing housing. This imbalance of power within the housing market translates fiscal concerns into material ones. In essence, housing is by far the most critical architectural, social, and economic problem that exists beyond your simple well-being as an individual. Tonight, we're joined by Ali Karimi, a Bahraini architect interested in social housing, public space, and infrastructural reimaginings of the Gulf countries. Ali was recently the co-curator of the Kuwait Pavilion titled Between East and West, a Gulf, at the 2016 Venice Biennale with Hamid Bouhamsi. He has also conducted research on government-built housing in the GCC with the Affordable Housing Institute in Boston as a joint Center for Housing Studies Fellow, and in Havana with a grant, Havana, Cuba, that is, with a grant from the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. His work has been published in San Rocco, Clog, Wallpaper Magazine, and other media outlets. Ali is a graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he received a Master in Architecture. He's worked in Brussels with Office KGDBS, in New York with SOIL, and in Santiago, Chile with Elemental. In addition to his time abroad, he has also attained regional experience in public projects through his time in Bahrain with Gulf House Engineering. And I should add to that, Ali is also a longtime colleague and friend. We go way back. We went to school together and undergrad school. So having said that, please join me in welcoming Ali with a big round of applause.
I actually used to have that on the first line of my resume. Ali Karimi knows Ali Lawi, but no one would hire me because they just keep trying to hire him. So we've been trying to organize this lecture for almost a year now. Ali and I have been saying, well, maybe it'll be May last year, and then we kept putting it off, timings would change, and so it's been a long time coming. But also, unfortunately, and for anyone who's done a thesis, you know that something that's been a long time coming, especially when it's something you do in school, a year later, it becomes more and more sour, your positions on it change, your perspective on it changes. And so somehow, for me, it's interesting because it's almost, in 3 weeks, it'll be the 1-year anniversary of this thesis. And looking at it now and in preparing the slides, there's a lot of these moments of oh, okay, I didn't know I knew that. But also moments of, oh, no, that's completely wrong. So as we kind of have this conversation today, and I think I definitely highlight the word or the emphasis on conversation. I'll try to leave a good amount of time at the end. But also I think, as Ali Lari mentioned, housing among architects, but also as I'll show in the presentation, in Bahrain is perhaps the only common language that people share. For architects, definitely, it's the common tongue by which we speak. It's the measure of societies, the measure of cities. And as well for architects, other than architects in Bahrain, it becomes one of the ways which we can have conversations that have no other venues. I'd like to begin first of all by thanking Ali, kind of following off the previous point for this event, AIA Middle East. Thanking you all for being here, but also thanking the people who contributed to this thesis. I'm not going to name them by name, but there's a few of you, and I'll thank you after the event. Hugely influential, and so sorry if there's parts here that maybe you disagree with, but I think that's part of the conversation. And so, and I actually should say, although it's not good to maybe start the lecture with an apology, I think this is a lecture that maybe would have been way sweeter on the ears in Arabic, and maybe would speak to a lot of to the issues more articulately in Arabic. But we'll be recording, and I know there's a few of you here for whom Arabic is maybe not a first language, but I think later in the conversation, or if there's any questions that come up on the terminology, a few of the turns of phrase, please don't hesitate to ask. And later on also there's a few postcards for those of you whose friends couldn't make it or who want to send letters or postcards to friends abroad. Anyway, I've been asked to put a few slides in the beginning, just mentioning that I'm a registered provider with the AIA for this event. The course description, which I assume if you're here, you either know what it's about, or hopefully by the time we're done, you will know what it's about. The learning objectives, which I'll summarize in a bit. So the title of the thesis is Good Arab, Bad City, and it was a summary of a year's worth of research on the GCC. Most of the points talk about other countries in the GCC, or a large part of the research begins before Bahrain. And it primarily deals with the topic of housing in the GCC. So I'll be talking about a phenomenon that happens through the GCC, and the book itself delves into the history of cities as a project in the region, the history of how we imagine cities, and also particular cases of housing in the Gulf, Sawabra complex in Kuwait, John Harris's proposals, Candilis's proposals, and others in the Gulf, and also the history of oil towns. However, for today, I'll be talking, well, one, because of the audience, I'll be talking primarily about Bahrain. So why Bahrain in particular? Well, during, I guess the conversation perhaps on housing begins 60 years ago, but let's begin it 5 years ago or 6 years ago in 2011. the Gulf countries, or at least the Arabian side of the Gulf countries of Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi, UAE, Oman, and Qatar, all experienced different degrees of political and social turmoil. Pressure is exerted on regional governments for increased democratization, better economies, and a general desire for change. And in Bahrain, no less. But what makes Bahrain an interesting case, and the reason why this lecture specifically talks about Bahrain, is because you can look at Bahrain as maybe the case study that is more acute, more exasperated by virtues of the size, by virtues of the island, but also the length of Bahrain's affair with public housing. And what makes it really interesting in the case of Bahrain is that, as the sign would say, the journey has begun. Now the number has gone up from 40,000 units to 60,000, but the idea of a journey beginning in 2011 and where it ends now is an interesting one, because ultimately you ask, well, whose journey is it, and to what end does it go? And really, what is the promise that is so important to the health and longevity of a state? But I think also it must be said, for architects, I mean, these discussions on politics are interesting in general, but the idea of the journey to build 40,000 units being such an important part of the Bahraini discourse is an interesting one for architects, in particular because in 2011, the only solution perhaps that could be turned to, or the only way governments of the Gulf could imagine their countries after the Arab Spring, was through architecture. The Gulf governments, all to varying degrees, whether it's 60,000 units or 40,000 units in this case, or 100,000 in Kuwait, or more in Saudi and elsewhere, all these governments had one thing in common: expansive national housing projects, a new era of new towns and new cities, and a reimagining of the Gulf city or the Gulf state in the 21st century. And you can see similar cases to these signs everywhere in the Gulf. And I've got images of them in the book as well. So although the phenomenon is apparent in the Gulf, the conversation really is the same. And the conversation occurs amidst protests, and also amidst a conversation on what the issue is really. How many housing units do we lack? How many do we need? How many do we need to build? And so, what this lecture will show is really Bahrain becomes this case, but for people here from Qatar, Kuwait, the discussion is a familiar one, the questions and issues are a familiar one, but to different degrees. Maybe not as bad in one place, maybe different, or of a different political nature in another. But Bahrain is ultimately a paradigm of a nation with an addiction to a particular mode of urbanity, a particular way of producing cities, and an architectural typology, being the single-family detached home, associated with that city making. So, to put it in context, 40,000 units in the context of a country like Bahrain would be more like, for a country of 1 million people, for an estimated housing stock of almost 200,000, or a little less depending on whose estimates you listen to say that that within the next 10 years it'll build over a quarter of the existing housing stock and more, and to house between a third to a half of the national population would be the equivalent of New York City saying, hey, we're going to build Manhattan within the next 8 years, or build another one. And so you can see these everywhere. I'm sure most of the people in this room live either next to one of these, live in one of these, or will be living in one of these, near one of these within the next 5 years. I'm sure you definitely passed one driving here, because actually there's a few on the way. And to put it in context, the reason why Bahrain's case is interesting isn't so much because it's just Bahrain's case. And not because it's everyone else's case, but in fact, it's because everyone else's problem is Bahrain's problem, and Bahrain's problem is everyone else's problem. So, and sorry for the resolution of the projector. Basically what this shows, this is the amount of dollars per citizen if you take either the US total revenue made from tax dollars, or money made from oil and total exports. So in the case of Qatar, you have almost $500,000 per citizen. Coming down to Kuwait, you have 33,000, 29,000 in the case of Bahrain, and then when you get to the US, it's about $11,000. So we still got more money per citizen as the US, but nowhere near the amounts that Qatar has. And if we look at it on the case of just comparative between Kuwait and Bahrain, this is the percentage of non-nationals to nationals. So in the case of Kuwait, it's about 67 to 33. And in the case of Bahrain, it's, depending on whose estimates you listen to, about 50-50. And although it doesn't show, this percentage is all the housing built in Kuwait over the past, up until 2012. So approximately 12% of the total necessary amount of housing, or about 30 to 40% of all the housing needed for nationals. And projections, if the Kuwaitis in fact build all that they say they'll build, it'll go up to almost 70% of the national population. Bahrain, similarly. Currently, it's a much smaller degree, so about 20% to 30% of the Bahraini population lives or has lived in government-built housing. And if all the projects get done as projected, then between 70 to 80%. I'll go through these fairly quickly. There may be some points we can return to later, just because I'd rather not dwell on the graphs. But it's more of research in case the questions come up. But if we look at the number of the increasing demand for units, the increasing demand for housing units, you can see a drastic increase, at least in the later years, and projected that even the relative percentage of housing units that the Bahraini population depended on. So if, let's say, up until 2012, 1 in every 5 was living in government-built housing, the expectation relative to the amount of units that are being built, the wait list, and also the projected amount of units says that if 1 in every 5 people, so basically almost 1 in person, or maybe 1.5 people in every row, will live in government-built housing. In fact, in the end of the next 10 years, most of the people in each row, assuming you're Bahraini, will be living in it. But also, now that I've touched on that point, out of the total applications for the government housing, you can see that the number of houses has increased dramatically relative to the number of people looking for land, which has plummeted, people looking for flats, which has also gone down, and the people looking for loans. So what happens between 1994 till, let's say, 2001, even in this case, and even more so later, that suddenly if half of the population before applied for loans, flats, after that point, it becomes half of the population, or over half of the population. In fact, in 2001, almost 3/4 says, actually, we just want a house. I don't need a loan, I don't need a flat. And so, going back to why Bahrain's problem is a Gulf problem. Well, in fact, you can say, all right, well, maybe Bahrain can still afford more than the US can afford. Maybe we can afford to produce this housing. But in fact, that's not the case. Recently, the GCC Marshall Plan approved $10 billion of support to Bahrain to fund the housing. So basically what that means is that as Bahrain's housing initiatives had to be funded by the UAE, Qatar, Saudi, and Kuwait as part of this GCC master plan. So in Bahrain, the necessity of solving housing isn't just an architectural problem or an urban one, it's a political one. And the architectural crisis of Bahrain is not only one where one government has to tackle it, but in fact, it's one where all regional governments are financially, politically, and ultimately architecturally implicated. So if Bahrain sneezes, everyone gets sick, I guess is the logic. Or if a Bahraini needs a house, everyone has to pitch in. Which maybe would be fine if Bahrain was much larger. But in fact, the other part of the problem is Bahrain has had to meet the need for housing through extensive land reclamation. And so we are ultimately all inhabiting a country that has increased in size by over 25% in the past 50 years and continues to grow. And if we look at the housing projects over this time, we can see there's almost a one-to-one relationship. So if in 1971, or when Bahrain became independent, primarily the housing existed either in Harrag, Medinat al-Ammal. There's of course other kind of housing compounds, but also the beginnings of Isa Town. And over time, the development of Hamad Town, also the housing in the interior of the country, more projects in Muharraq as well. But as we move forward by 2000 till today, you see increasingly it's definitely the increasing density in the center, but more so the occupation of the periphery. And for those of you here in Bahrain, this is a natural thing. So around 30,000 of the 40,000 units projected exist on the periphery on reclaimed land. But what makes it interesting, and you can see this over time. But what makes it interesting is, well, first of all, Bahrain is relatively, and also, I mean, you have to consider the oil land in this. Bahrain relatively is not actually filled out, but government housing is 30% of all built-up area in Bahrain. So not only is Bahrain's government housing a big part of, let's say, the political situation, but it's also a lion's share of its urbanity. And this is not only related to, let's say, patterns of growth over time or government projects, but in fact, up until 2002, all planning in Bahrain existed underneath the Ministry of Housing as its own commission. So until 2002, not only was the city in service of housing and urbanity made up largely of housing, but in fact, up until 2002, one could argue that all planning in Bahrain was in service of housing. So if you were doing planning, you were figuring out where to put houses and how to put them. And so to take another step, how we plan in Bahrain, how we understand a future is not, let's say, just the idea of where to put roads, where to put sewage and electricity. It is a political project, right? If planning is to serve the aim of producing housing, and housing with a certain political aim. And so the very idea of planning is the idea of a political project with the goal of providing government-built housing. Planning, the exercise of strategizing and conceiving a particular political vision for a nation. In Bahrain is the implementation of a particular set of urban phenomena, a particular architectural scenario, in hopes of that scenario yielding a specific political climate. And you can argue this for many other countries. That's part of the nature of planning. But planning in Bahrain, because it's in service of housing, produced government-built cities, housing cities, which in turn ideally appease the population and promote stability. So how is it, oh sorry, I guess it's a little dark. So how is it that the government of Bahrain could arrive at a point where the need to provide a particular architectural typology, being the single-family home, which I'll show in a bit, and its associated urbanity, can only be solved through funding from other neighboring countries? And how has it come to the point that this crisis requires the complete change of the landmass of the country? And also, how, in the interest of architects, how is it that the conflation of national crisis is one-to-one with an architectural crisis? One that must be resolved at all costs, or at least at the cost of ecological and economic viability in some cases. The Thesis book touches on this at greater depth, particularly the character of Charles Belgrave. As in the case of the other Gulf countries, the process of arriving to the current housing crisis began in the early 20th century. And in the case of Bahrain, housing began prior to Bahrain's independence. And I would argue that the first person to imagine Bahrain as a total ecology, so as a total political and ecological project, although I won't delve into the character too much because of time limits today, was the figure of Charles Belgrave, here shown in Life magazine, saying forward to the backward. And the article, which was printed in the 1950s, I believe it was 1952, talked about Belgrave as this crucial figure in bringing in the oil pipelines, or overseeing their construction, bringing in schools and modern education, spraying DDT to get rid of mosquitoes, helping construct healthcare. He was also in charge of the courts, the police, planning to various degrees, but also, and the reason why I say this man was perhaps the first man who envisioned the totalizing Bahrain, was he was also in charge of the planning of the Bahraini waterfront of Manama, and the creation of Bab al-Bahrain as a gateway to Bahrain. So the idea for this man of these systems isn't saying, well, let me just plan to create a school or plan to exterminate malaria, but in fact the idea that Bahrain should be looked at as a system where all these changes amount to the political stability of a country, whether it's banning alcohol or hosting dinner parties for Saudi royalty and picking out the drapes. So in his stories, he says, well, we had to pick these drapes, the Saudis prefer this color, and so on and so forth. So this guy really inhabited a world in Bahrain where you could imagine the entirety of Bahrain as a single person and envision it as a sum of all its parts. He was also, depending on whose accounts you listen to, the de facto administrator of Bahrain from 1926 to 1957. then he was forced to remove, partially by the British and partially because of protests, for being too active in the Bahraini government. But the public agenda of Bahrain began really with Belgrave, and so with the idea of the importation of a welfare state, Belgrave argued that a modern nation, but really argued for the idea of a modern nation, argued that, well, you need to provide schools, you need to provide welfare housing. And these are trends you could see in World War II at the same time. I mean, what Belgrave was proposing in the construction of housing in the early 50s, through the municipality, or even pushing for what would later become Isa Town, was occurring elsewhere in the world. And not just in the Middle East, of course, but also elsewhere in Europe, which was urbanizing and building suburban housing after World War II. The only difference is if in the case of, let's say, the US, the housing projects would over time trickle down to far, far fewer by the 80s and would end, and it would turn into more neoliberalized policies where the provision of housing occurred through funding mechanisms. In the case of Bahrain, we still insisted on producing the housing ourselves. And I show here the case of what, according to their own brochure, I'm not actually sure if this is true, Awali, the world's first fully air-conditioned town. This occurred at the same time. So now we're trying to figure out, well, okay, what's the reason why the Western countries stopped, but we kept producing? Where's the first examples of ultimately single-family homes didn't exist before, let's say, the 1900s in Bahrain in the form we know them today? And I'd argue that really the first example of the housing models we know today arose, one, in Awali, in the Babka housing compound, although Bahrainis did not occupy it until I believe the late 60s. Babka only provided loans through which Bahrainis could build their own housing. They didn't allow the settlement of Bahrainis in the compound. But ultimately it began the influx of consultants, British consultants who planned Awali and then would later work on other projects. But also the idea and the scale of producing Awali begins a sort of path dependency which would be applied elsewhere. And you can see this also in various other cases. For example, Mohammed Makkiya, I believe in 84, 85, did plans for housing in Awali, and then would also be doing plans for housing elsewhere, public housing, and different, and also for government building. So not only, let's say, is this a model which you can look to and say, well, we want the fully first air-conditioned town for Bahrainis in Isa Town, let's say, but really these are the same people working on it anywhere, everywhere else in the Gulf. So, after 3 years after Belgrave's departure, and the beginning of Medinat Ammar in the 50s, during his time, Bahrain began the work on Isa Town, south of the capital of Manama. Planned by British consultants in the 1960s, the town was the first large-scale initiative of a fledgling welfare state as it began to understand itself, or the modern state. And so this would be the first planned town of its scale in Bahrain, not including Awali, which was also not of the same scale. So the project of political legitimacy, modernization, and nation building all crystallized really in this one moment for Bahrain in Isa Town. And it was built, when it was built, there was a quote which was, later on in the Habitat 2 conference: "The construction of this town is considered to be a pioneer step toward the formation of a new urban society equipped with essential urbanized requirements to catch up to the rise in standards of living, the modern rise in standards of living." And so Isa Town in the 60s really introduced the single-family villa, an abstracted form of the one in Awali, as the typology for a Bahraini citizen, although it was far at the time, and the implementation of British building codes to a new city. But also it began really a conflation of the idea of a modern citizen with the idea of an architectural typology. So really Isa Town is the first point where suddenly I look to that and say, well, that's my right, or that is what's fit for a citizen. And you also have to understand, at the time, some people said, well, I don't want to go to Isa Town. I'd rather be in Manama, I'd rather be in Muharraq. Who wants to go so far away? And so you can't say, oh, well, they built it and then people came and obviously people were settled in there. But the idea of this is being fit for a Bahraini was also a political project. There were people telling you, well, this is, like the Habitat 2 quote, this is the modern state. This is what's fit for a Bahraini. These are new standards of cleanliness and health. And so it's not just a matter of building it and they will come, but really an active political project and saying, no, this is what's fit and what's not. And you can see this obviously everywhere in the Gulf. Kuwait's own branding of their housing, the different plans, and also, and you can really see these in also any TV show of the time, which talks about really the idea of moving out of, in the case of Kuwait, Dira. These are a little light, but so what's interesting, so you can say, all right, 1968, we did this, and although I'm sorry, this is so light. Although the facades change, in fact, in over 50 years of different housing typologies, the plot sizes decrease, but the built area of the housing more or less fluctuates and remains the same. So actually, in over almost 60 years of housing, these are models of about 48 of, let's say, the 50 done before 2000, and then the last few of the ones done after. Really, in 50 years, we've not come so far. I mean, the only difference is you have to remove these trees and maybe the garden up here, but really in 50 years, in fact, we've been bound to more or less this idea of this is the minimum amount you need to provide a citizen. And anything less is maybe even unconstitutional. And so I won't go through all of these, but for the most part, they all share the kind of basic DNA. I picked a few of the kind of single story ones just because they show you really the fundamental characteristics and the basic pieces necessary for, let's say, the Arab town. So what I find interesting about these, I mean, for the most part, it's similar to, let's say, any modern villa. You could argue the presence of a kitchen, a dining room, 2 bedrooms. So the dining room, 2 bedrooms in the back, a little washroom, a bathroom. The kitchen's right here. What I find interesting, though, and really this is where this diverges from, let's say, the Awali model, is the idea of a majlis. And I mean, all of you are familiar with the majlis, the idea of the, let's say, the public gathering room or the public family room in a house. But even though, let's say, plot size is diminished, the idea of that public room persists in all of these typologies, which I think is an interesting thing. So, for example, it's an interesting thing, and I don't want to belabor the kind of points in other countries, but in the case of Kuwait, for example, the idea of Diwani is also extremely important, and critiques of apartment buildings there would say, wait, you removed the majlis or you removed the Diwani from our apartment, and I don't want to live in an apartment. This is the case of Sawabar. For most of you familiar, this is an example of one in Harrag, which was produced as an extension to an existing home. And so we can also look at the various other housing prototypes, some of them 2 floors, which I'll show in a bit, some of them 1 floor but larger. But then we ask, well, what happened to these guys? Why did no one want to live in these? So the Bahraini government did try to introduce alternative models of housing. And also through policy try to encourage people to get their loans, land, building their own. And so not only, there wasn't only the attempt to, let's say, produce this and different variations with arches and whatnot. But in the 70s, apartments were prototyped initially as a place to put people on a wait list while waiting for housing for Isa Town and elsewhere. So, or people that wanted to live closer to Muharraq, or people that were just there waiting until you could get a house for yourself. But that quickly became part of the problem. People would see the apartments as, well, I'll be here for 5 years and then I'm out. As a temporary solution fit for foreigners and immigrants, but not for Bahrainis. And these are actually, in this photo, you can see the new models of single-family houses, and these are already being demolished. So there's actually a bunch of these, you can see these in Muharraq, were demolished to build actually less units. So if you're talking about, if the issue is to build more units, I believe, I had it in another slide, but I think there was 80 units before, and now there's 40, almost half, after you demolish all the apartment buildings and put in single-family homes. And these are the plan, but actually what the interesting thing is in this one, you see that there's still, even in the apartment, a majlis. And you see these everywhere. You see them in Isa Town as well. And now what you have, so those were about close to 100 square meters, so about half of the government-built home. So the government has also tried to change the apartment model to make it more appealing, doubling the square footages almost. So these are 180. There's some that are 200 square meters. So there's also the idea, well, maybe we can make these apartments a bit more appealing. maybe we can make them bigger, and now they begin to approach the plot size of a normal house, but still retaining the majlis. And I emphasize this because it'll be a point that initiates the design portion. And this is more or less the contemporary house today. The majlis, the kind of strange living room that looks out onto the stair, the backyard on the front porch, but you can already see it's shrinking. And then the bedrooms on the second floor. And also, and as soon as you drive past any of these, you'll see they've all been immediately changed. My favorite ones are the ones where you get a Range Rover parked outside and it's all marble clad and fully extended to the plot line. So I mean, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it's so you already see that. I mean, if you visit these now, you sometimes you can't tell which one's which, and in 10 years they'll probably all be different. So. So where do we get to? Well, we have, I guess, 5 problems. 1, the conflation of a single type with citizenship. You're only a citizen if you live in family housing or single family housing, or sorry, a single family villa. The rejection of an apartment typology in favor of the single family house. Urbanization in service of essentially the 1960s social contract. The idea of what you get and what you're entitled to is more or less the same. Maybe you get less garden. Increasing infrastructure costs to build suburbs or dormitory towns of varying degrees. But ultimately, and this is really what the lecture has been building up to, that housing is ultimately a missed opportunity to address the national scale. I mean, when people like Belgrade, for example, imagined housing in the 1950s, they said, hey, this is what we need to do to make Bahrain a modern nation. This is the institutions we need to create to allow for this to happen. And really, it was extremely radical because it was the total reimagining of a government, of cities, and of a place to serve this vision that this character had. And so I'll be moving specifically to Muharrag, talking about this issue in the case of Muharrag, and looking at the end of the thesis, which was the proposal for, well, what if we did things differently? So this is Muharrag over time. I don't want to go too deeply into the layers from 1810 till today. But it's important to mention these layers, not to kind of fetishize the growth of Muharrag, which we all know, but really because by looking at Muharrag, you see the growth of the town, first through the kind of radial growth occupying the island, and then over time, the kind of creation of these buildings in the 1930s, the expansion of the typologies, which, for example, the stores, the port fronts, apartment buildings. So the first round of reclamation here, then the filling of Al-Hada, and then the first round of housing on the periphery. So really, the Muharrag we occupy now is one that's grown like an onion over time, but ultimately an onion which has been strangled by the roads built around, and primarily government villa housing here, but also the market, and then suburban housing on the other side. And so these diagrams are maybe, let's go over them, but diagrams of the location of the mosque. Well, actually I'll say, what's interesting about Muharrag as a case study is not only the fact that it represents what I argue will be the problem of Bahrain in 30 years, which is Bahrain shows what happens when a city grows in kind of the creation of layers of infrastructure, or layers of housing, without, let's say, a totalizing plan on how to imagine the maintaining of those layers as viable places in the city. So without the ability to really coax in infrastructure, without the ability to coax in parking. And so what we have today, you could argue, I'm not going to go back all the way, but the creation of these dormitory towns in the island is maybe the next level of a plan of reclamation by accretion, or reclamation and growth by accretion. But Muharrag is still interesting because, yeah, you get a mix of program, the mix of mosque. These are the empty lots, so there's actually sometimes a little bit of room in Muharrag to maneuver. But it's mixed use, it's dense, it's far denser than most of Bahrain, with the exception of the really dense parts of Manama. And also, this is actually commercial, so it's also a great example of just mixed use by virtue of its kind of commercial avenues. But it also suffers from, as you all know, a huge transportation problem. So this is the kind of distance of public transportation. So if you live here in Muharrag, you've got to either go to, let's say, the post office or around the periphery to be able to catch a ride. And if you're coming in from, let's say, Manama, and you want to go home, your best bet is to take a walk. And And so Muharraq exists in this kind of neither here nor there zone. And this is maybe another discussion on just the issue of preservation of Muharraq. But if you leave it the way it is, it becomes this over time. Either through kind of arguments between families over who gets the right to build on the house, money, expense, the fact that it's way more reasonable, let's say, to just build an apartment building and fill it with immigrants than to build a house or to refurbish your existing one. Or you get the alternative where government-built housing comes in, trying to emulate the models elsewhere. It maintains maybe some of the plot lines, but you either end up demolition by carelessness or demolition by necessity to bring in affordable housing or new government-built houses. And you can already see this in the south Muharraq, but it'll be happening elsewhere too. So this is a proposal for over here, India. But what's interesting, and going back to the onion of that is Muharraq, this is a little light. But basically, if you cut one line through Muharraq, you see all the different layers. You can see the early 1810s to 1830s, the layers in the early 1900s, and so on. So in fact, you only need to cut one slice through the city to see everything from courtyard typologies to the apartment buildings, in fact, the new single-family home. So Muharraq is also extremely useful paradigmatically because all of Muharraq, or all of Bahrain is in Muharraq, as an urban condition, as a cultural condition, as an architectural condition. And this is a model of Muharraq and then the proposal as well. And before talking about the proposal, I'd like to begin with pulling back and talking about, let's say, the idea of the city through its basic typology. So, this is the Prophet's mosque and house in Medina, which, for the intensive purposes here, I'll talk about it as, let's say, the archetypal courtyard condition. If Muharraq is full of these courtyard houses, it's useful to maybe talk about for a moment the first courtyard house, let's say, or the idea of the courtyard houses exists in the Islamic context. And in fact, the construction of this building is, if any of you guys are familiar with the story of Medina, the construction of the mosque is fundamental to the act of creating Medina. So the use of the courtyard type was the courtyard type of the single family, well, not single, sorry, the courtyard houses you see here, really just a wall initially and a few rooms, and over time would be expanded, is the first spatial instantiation of a population. So the idea of, really, this is the minimum amount of space for the idea of the ummah, and also the idea of, let's say, a family, which I think is an interesting thing. And also it's a part of the rebranding of Medina, like showing up, creating the house, and changing its name to Medina is a complete act of reimagining a state, a city, but then also what a city is through just one building. So in fact, you don't need to completely rebuild and tear down Medina. You only had to build one building, and suddenly it was a completely different city. And so the idea of using architecture here to denote community is fundamental to the sovereignty of the fledgling Islamic community through its initial unit. And so, although it's no more than a boundary wall condition and a partially roofed courtyard, it's an inhabitable place to exclusively mark the core political body of an Islamic state and a community of faithful in a territorial dimension. And over time it would change, it would grow, and it would expand to fit the kind of context of the surroundings, but it retained the deep structure of the courtyard type. And I'd like to emphasize here that I don't bring this up as a precedent to ground the importance of the courtyard typology in a theological canon. I'm not saying that cities in the Middle East grew because of some idea of a house or the prophet or any religious background. Not at all. The aim is to look at the courtyard type at its most abstract, the cleanest, simplest way of understanding what is at stake and what is understood through even just a wall and a square. And in fact, the importance of a courtyard type in that case is ability to formalize public on a local scale. So the idea of this being a home, but also a communal space. And the idea of collective space in a city occurring through the diffusion of courtyard types, whether in mosques, larger houses, schools, and whatnot. So the house here is in fact a diagram through which we understand community and cities as units of courtyards. And so going to the scale of Muharraq, the proposal kind of sets itself maybe 10 years in the past. It says, what if in the early 2000s we decided, or the government sat down and asked itself, well, okay, Bahrain is going to be destroyed over time if we don't do anything, or we're going to destroy it ourselves to build single-family villas. What's the minimum amount of destruction that needs to happen to make Bahrain viable? This is also a paradigmatic condition. But for the sake of an argument, let's say, okay, well, do we have to destroy 100 houses to make Bahrain work? Do we have to destroy 300 houses? Well, what if we put a single strip running across the length of the inaccessible parts of Bahrain, as a series of urban courtyards, connecting what eventually would be parks on two sides, running parking underground, and saying, well, and leaving, of course, the Ismail Ali house, the Grand Mosque, and so on, and said, okay, maybe if we only demolish this strip of Bahrain, you can put enough parking, enough housing, new housing for Bahraini citizens, then Bahrain would over time would have the amenities it needed. Maybe. And so this is as a diagram, so or an abstraction of the Prophet's house, a series of an extension of that courtyard and its relationships. And so what if we imagined, in fact, government-built housing as a way of reconnecting Bahrain through a series of parks, soccer courts, maybe a mosque, tennis courts, and let's say even business complexes. So by spanning the strip of Bahrain, we use government-built housing as a way of dealing with brownfield and neglected sites, or let's say neglected city to some extent, as a way of densifying parts of an existing city, and also connecting reclaimed and disconnected fabric. So as a paradigmatic condition, it argues how do you connect the disconnected Gulf city and connecting the different rings which have been broken over time. So the building runs for 2 kilometers, but I'd argue maybe it's perhaps the minimum amount of demolition needed to save that part of town, re-energizing the city through the influx of maybe new programmatic elements, parking, and over time perhaps the area nearby would follow suit. Actually, I'll also add to that maybe another argument, which is even if you look at the oldest houses in Bahrain, they're not particularly old, in the sense that maybe some of the old examples are 100, 150, maybe if you're being generous, 200, if you're being extremely generous. And so what's important perhaps is not that a house which falls apart gets replaced, or every year where you're replacing the walls, but in fact it's really the idea of a house which has been sustained. So in Bahrain over time the house may fall apart, but the idea of maintaining a house through the creation of lime and gypsum and maintaining the typology of the courtyard house, maybe that's also truer to the idea of a house in Bahrain than the idea of saying, well, this house has existed for 50 years and so it's historic. So this is a quick section of, let's say, the neighborhood scale of the proposal, respecting some routes, creating the sort of central courtyards in a bit, and following in some areas the existing lines of houses along the different areas. And you see here it spans between the suburbs and then the older fabric. You can see it also in the top view. And so, well, now that we've looked at, let's say, the larger configuration at the larger scale, it also begins to consider existing typologies, these mainly being the souk, and also down here the expansion that would occur in the early part of the 20th century. The idea of these stalls and the relationship to each other under a shaded walkway, which you also see Bahrain today, the idea of kind of this outdoor space outside maybe a majlis where people sit and kind of talk or play cards. The project proposes 4 fundamental new government house units, maintaining 200 square meters, but in fact reimagining their configurations in different ways. So the first one, all of them share the same component, that they're in fact lifted off the ground, and the only piece that touches the ground is the majlis. So in fact, the unit is as a majlis as entry point with bathroom and stair, and then on the second floor you go up to a kitchen dining room and 3 bedrooms with a garden in the middle. Or a second type, which also lifts off the ground, But here it's the idea of coming up to a garden, a central corridor lit by skylights, and also by the creation of these little atria as well, with different configurations of rooms so that each room has its own view down onto the bottom. Or perhaps a third example, where the house has is more of a lifted courtyard with a space in the middle looking down onto the space of the majlis, and 4 gardens in each corner. So in fact, every bedroom gets its own little garden in the corner, and the bathrooms are shared in the middle, and the dining room, of course. And then a fourth type, this one in 3-story for the larger families, this one more abstracted, spiral staircase, the majlis of course on the bottom floor, a completely kind of free plan condition where you'd rise and find yourself in the middle of a living room, dining room, and then 4 vaulted rooms, each with their own atrium looking down all the way through, and also their own garden. And so it leaves this covered shaded pathway which cuts through the city, and what exists on the bottom floor becomes this field condition of majlis, carpet, maybe guys smoking, and shaded walkway to carry you through Harrah. The model of it. And so this is the condition you see in plan. Now once you take all these types and begin to put them next to each other, you begin to see the relationship of unit to unit, and also the relationship then of these units to the larger, so the courtyard to the individual unit, and then the courtyard magnified to the scale of the city. And one kind of note to this, I think, is one of the questions that came up was really the idea of single-family houses in the Gulf maybe exists in the idea of individuals with no public, right? Like most of these don't have like even trees outside of the house. They exist because they secure the autonomy of an individual in the society. And so cities exist as an aggregation of individuals, as an aggregation of suburban homes with a road connecting them. So the only thing shared between the Bahraini and another Bahraini is the road and the sidewalk you park on. And this almost argues that, well, if we have a ground floor made up of this open space of majlises, beginning to create its own clusters by its orientation onto each other, the different paving maybe suggests, well, are we a neighborhood? Are we a neighborhood? Is this path what connects us? But also, one person's expansion not only affects their own unit, but also begins to affect their neighbors. So if I have 4 courtyards, and my room or my majlis gets lit from 4 sides, and then I decide to expand to the lot line, I've made the area for my neighbors dark, but also my majlis gets no natural light. And I think for me, the paradigmatic condition is not so much also about the success of a unit as saying, well, this is what's fit, but it's saying this is the compromise you learn from expansion. The idea of yourself relative to a larger community, but also yourself relative to what's gained and taken by your own architectural decision. So you become aware, in fact, you become extremely aware of the architecture as being something you decide on and not something that exists in absence of everyone else. So it takes Harrah as a new way of tackling government housing in the Gulf as an alternative to the planning of suburbs and dormitory towns, but really as a way of reimagining what's at stake in the region. Reintegrating the idea of public and civic as parts of a national project, instead of the idea of housing as the complete destruction of a national project, or the complete inability to discuss a national project. Using government-built housing as a way of dealing with these neglected sites, but really using the idea of really the starting point of housing, which is that the project of a city is the project of a nation. The way we imagine our cities is the way we imagine Bahrain, and the way we imagine ourselves as citizens. So this proposal, this is a section with the parking running through. This proposal imagines 1,000 units, but it hopes that that's the least amount of housing that needs to be done in Harrah for the rest of Harrah to follow suit. And ultimately, the argument here, I'll stay on the lighter slide for a bit. Ultimately, the question of housing, or at least as I've tried to show it today, the scale of the Gulf, the question of housing and the question of the national is the question of the city. the planning of cities is the planning of a country because of scale, because of the amount of population relative to the city, but also because of our own capacity to imagine these countries. It's a direct one-to-one correlation of city to state to nation. And changing demographics, population size, and the role of cities demands an assessment of the city as a social endeavor. This thesis attempted to shed light on what the city has been in the Gulf, the idea of the city and maybe where it originated. The book talks a bit more about the planning of cities of Baghdad, the planning of other cities in the region, the idea of Kuwait through its housing, which are all equally important parallels. But ultimately, it's asking how the cities exist as a political and social endeavor around what the government imagines itself to do, the way the government imagines its own legitimacy and the need to produce its own legitimacy through its own perception of a welfare state or what a welfare state should be. But it really asks how we construct the idea of a citizen. If our only conversation in a political medium will be about government-built housing, then let's make it a useful conversation. Let's not say, well, I want a house now, but maybe do I want a house? Why do I want a house? What kind of house do we want? What if I'm a single mother? What if I want to live with a friend? And these are completely important questions. And also, well, why do they have to be the way they've been for the last 50 years? And I think as architects, well, as citizens it's important, but I think as architects, really it's up to us as a community to be able to have these discussions, to bring a certain level of intelligence and charisma to these questions, and also to imagine alternatives. Maybe destructive, but I think it's also good to imagine a case that's so antithetical to the things you hold dear that you say, well, I'd rather not have that. Can't we imagine something more useful or more positive? And ultimately, this thesis puts to rest the idea of a placeless Gulf, right? The idea of a Gulf or Bahrain without context. It elucidates the city as a product of clear and lucid imagination, as a series of political relations, the development of tribal relations from the sheikh, let's say one sheikh and the tribes that he gives land or benefits to the translation of that into a model state where we go from, well, let's say if the European city is égalité, liberté, et fraternité, then the Gulf state is no taxation, no representation, but a free house. And so Good or Bad City shows, hey, actually the Gulf city isn't new. We've been doing this for over 70 years. And in fact, it's not something that is placed out of nowhere, but it's a deeply entrenched political relationship and an idea of a rentier state and how a state should function, which is the distribution of oil rent and citizens' rights through oil. But more than a historical survey, it's ultimately a call for change and to reimagine another national through the invention of citizen and home. And so once the journey we're in ends, once 60,000 units are built, maybe Halab will go through a similar thing, right? Maybe these islands or the expansion that occurred around the central core will equally be disconnected islands somewhere else. And so the only way which, maybe in 30 years, the only way which we could salvage the projects that we built, that in 30 years people say, well, they maybe didn't get it right in the 2000s, will be the creation of another series of demolishing bands connecting those back to the city fabric, much like the 1,000 units in Harad. And so the only means of salvaging the 20th century Gulf city is will be through saying, well, maybe we didn't get it right. Maybe we'll end on the light one. This is Harad. So, yeah. Let's take questions. Sorry, it went on long. I see some tired eyes. Huh?
1 hour almost.
I know. No, it's funny because it was too long when I presented it as a thesis, and that was half an hour. But then it was too short, and then they kept asking what a majlis is, and this was a little too long. Sorry, and I told Lara I'd be keeping it to 45 minutes.
timing-wise, you're okay.
Okay, I guess, yeah, we still have half an hour. So the second half of the presentation, I'll be looking at the data.
Did you find the same phenomena in the other Gulf countries?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, because I think the case of Kuwait, maybe in some ways, I mentioned Kuwait because it's more paradigmatic in some ways. The case of Kuwait, they demolished, bought out all the citizens in the old city. Imagine basically everyone living in Harag, Tefin. They bought their houses, told them, بنعطيك 100,000 دينار, روح اسكن we will give you $100,000, go stay in Medina town, but give us your land to the government. And so they demolished it. So for them, it was really like, you had to take this deal. At least in Bahrain, there was a kind of, well, it's a free house, I might as well take it. In the case of Kuwait, it was something, it's a deal you couldn't afford not to take. But also the demolishment of old Kuwait really meant that there was nothing to go back to, right? Like in Bahrain, you could always say, I don't want to be in East Town, maybe I'll go fix up a house in Harag. In Kuwait, that's not an option. You either live in Shuwaykh or whatever, or you live in Salmiya. But also, Kuwait maybe had more interesting attempts at apartments. So the Sawabra compound, which was built in '82, was done by Arthur Erickson. It was much more, I don't think I have a slide of it, but let me pull it up. It was a much more interesting case maybe because it was done by Arthur Erickson, a much more prominent architect than any of the ones that I think worked on housing here. It's kind of international architect doing this huge housing scheme in the center of Kuwait. Sorry, I'm going to try to pull it up. But the interesting thing about, who of you have seen Sawabra or have been to Kuwait? So Sawabra actually was over 60% of all apartments, if not 70% of all apartments built in Kuwait up until Ghazwa. So the failure of Sawabra isn't just the failure of one apartment complex, but in fact it's almost a failure of all apartments in Kuwait. Which is funny because if you think about it, it's you're putting all your eggs in one basket. Your entire attempts to convince Kuwaitis to live in apartments hinged on the success of one apartment complex. Not that there were that many units in Sawabra to begin with compared to the amount of suburbs. So I just bring the example of Kuwait because you see another attempt to do apartments which failed in the Gulf, but also an attempt where there's no layers around an existing city, but in fact the wholesale demolition.
I don't know if I missed the first 15 minutes. So, can you tell me where the title comes from? Good Arab.
Yeah. So, I mean, the title for me, I tried so much harder to have a much better title. It's impossible to get a good title, especially for something as general as I tried housing, the national housing in the Gulf. But the title actually comes from Al-Farabi's book. So what is it? Ahl al-Madina al-Fadila, the occupants of the virtuous city. And so Al-Farabi, which is really a rewriting of Plato's Republic, except instead of philosopher king, you have a prophet imam. But what's interesting about it, so he's really taking Greek philosophy and applying it to a Middle Eastern context, translating a lot of the context. But what's interesting about it is Farabi goes and describes 6 cities, and he says, well, there's 6 possible cities in this ideal scenario. A city where, let's say, you have good rulers and bad citizens and bad rulers, good citizens and bad rulers, and so on. And he describes all these different cities and says, well, you can have a city where all the citizens are good, but if the rulers are bad, then you don't end up with a good city because blah, 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 blah. I mean, for him, it was really imagining the relationship of power to citizen, but also what happens when you put all these citizens together and what you get. And for me, well, I thought, well, in the case of maybe the contemporary Gulf city, it's the idea of the good Arab, or the Arab who has to behave and live in a government city house. But really, when you have all these good Arabs together, you end up with a bad city because you end up with cities made up of suburban homes. So really, the idea of me living as an individual doesn't add up to good cities because it's maybe a social justice, but it's a civic injustice. The creation of the government of that government. So really, it's suggesting another city, or it's taking Al-Farabi's virtuous city and saying, well, you can have a city made up of good citizens, maybe even good leadership, but ultimately bad cities because of everyone thinking they're being good citizens or acting as good citizens.
Thank you.
If I can comment on the title itself, I think it is a good title. It's better than Bad Arab, Good City. let me start a little bit. Thank you very much for very comprehensive, presentation. You have already identified the patterns, the problems, and you come with a solution, which you believe that it will be better than what the government is going to provide. Question: what are the changes which would require for this project to be implemented, to be a success? I am sure that you are aware, there are several dilemmas which the government is to develop, not of a defense of any. There is increased population versus increased number of demand for unit. Speed versus, which is like what we call developmental approach to housing. Product versus process. So how do you see this in relation of the project which you propose?
Right. I mean, first of all, it must be said, housing can't solve all the problems of a country. And I know you weren't suggesting that, but I was saying there's plenty of other political issues that can't be solved no matter how good you produce housing. But let's say if we understand let's say rentier theory as being the idea that a state, the state mechanisms, in fact, a rentier state is it's a welfare state, but it's not also a welfare state because a rentier state works on extracting oil rents and redistributing them to citizens. So also the idea of your political enfranchisement. Your political enfranchisement is me as a citizen getting a cut of oil rent, which is different from a welfare state because a welfare state is me as a citizen contributing a portion of money to a state which redistributes it equally. So politically it operates in a completely different way because on one hand I'm waiting on handouts and on the other I'm a citizen who has a share in a discourse ideally and then part of it comes back to me or doesn't. So the reason I say this is because, housing can't solve all problems, but let's say the provision of certain kinds of housing, you'd say maybe it'll create the armatures to produce good governance, right? Like the ability to maintain, produce government-built housing produces certain kinds of governments that need to mobilize money in certain ways. So maybe certain problems can be solved if you have the government that's able to produce, let's say, a different kind of housing. For a proposal like this to work, I don't want to go into the details, but it's the housing problem in Bahrain. It's a problem of mortgages and funding. The housing problem in Bahrain is also the problem of homeowners associations, but ultimately it's also and I think this is another problem. That's why I bring it up. Is you have to sell someone on a different kind of life, and you have to make it appealing. You've gone 50 years telling people that the only way you can be a citizen is if you get your house, and this is an important political project because it's a vision. Like someone said. My vision of a citizen is someone who will be quiet if I give him a house, maybe. Or someone's vision of a citizen is someone who lives in Isatan. And these things were sold and marketed and on good intentions, I'll add. Like, for example, when Belgrave imagined this housing, he believed that you needed this housing to build better cities, better transportation. These are steps on the way to a much better society. And in many ways, he's right. Better access to healthcare, better access to schools. And so, so these relationships, I'd say it's about really reimagining housing as an open discourse and an open dialogue. Not just saying, well, are we producing enough units? Where are we putting them? Are they close enough? But really, hey, and I think you see this already in Bahrain. Bank discounts saying, well, maybe this is what's appealing about an apartment. You're not paying loans. You can go to London, send your kids to good schools. And the US faces the same issue with public transportation. And we face the same issue with public transportation in Bahrain. You have to tell, these things are people's visions. Like the American citizen was sold on a private car, not a railroad, by companies portraying an American dream. And we did the same in Bahrain. We portrayed a particular Bahraini dream. And I think you have to be able to be imaginative with these things. You have to imagine other Bahrains.
How large is this problem? I wouldn't say problem. This issue, because you have such a large expat population in this region. Now, that population has consistently increased over the years, whereas the local citizen population is not expanding as fast. How does this contribute to your city?
Well, it's interesting. There's diagrams I cut in the interest of time. But for example, really the population shift in Bahrain hugely changed in 2000. So for example, I think up until maybe 1995 or so, it was closer to 70-30, and then within a 10-year span, it became more 50-50. So that change happened also over a really quick period of time. And I say this not just because I say that it's not an issue, but in fact say that it's an issue that has occurred really recently relative to the larger way we imagine housing. If you want to know how this project, well, also another thing to that, which is if you look at, let's say, the statistics for the number of people living in apartments, the density of Bahrain. I mean, Bahrainis are proud that we're one of the densest countries in the world, we're the densest country in the Gulf. But in fact, that's only, I mean, Bahrain, you quickly go from the density of San Francisco to Alaska within a 10-minute drive. And Bahrainis are living closer to the Alaska end than to the San Francisco end. The people living in the San Francisco end are the guys in Manama and Muharram. So we're not really living in that. We're also, the idea of what we live in is one and not the other. As for the solution to that problem, I don't think this is more of a looking at it. Let's say the idea of a broad 60-year span. Solving the problem for housing for immigrants is, I think, it fits within it, but I wouldn't say I have a solution for that. But I think it's one of those things. Yeah, the proposal is aware of and it imagines units that could be could serve that, but I wouldn't say it's tailored to one or another. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Actually, I have two questions. First one is, the Bahraini family, the number of the members keep increasing, so the growing of Bahraini family. So what will be the future of that proposed plan?
Actually,
how you will do the expansion to that? Especially the Bahraini people, they like to add and cladding the house with the orange color and some marbles, cheap tiles.
it's going to take me a sec to find this, but if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to speak incorrectly, but the Bahraini family has actually not grown significantly in size. In fact, the Bahraini family more or less has gotten smaller since the 50s and stayed about an average number of 4 to 5 people. What actually has increased is the number of house servants the Bahraini would have, which went from 0 in the, let's say, 40s to 1 or 2 now. But in terms of size, it's not increased dramatically. But I think also, in fact, not only that, but you also now our housing still imagines an ideal citizen who is a man with a wife living in a house with 2 or 3 bedrooms, 2 or 3 kids, and has images and so on. And so I think also it's important to really realize that it's still maybe the average Bahraini, but that's also a particular vision of what the Bahraini is. Let's say not a single mother or a widow or someone who marries his brother's wife when she dies, and all these kind of extremely other cases. Sorry, what was your second question?
Yeah, my second question is, can we go to the proposed plan, please?
Yeah. So I keep trying to find this other slide for you.
Yes, this one. This is the plan. So what will happen in case of fire? It will not spread to the others?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely possible that happens. You're right. There's certain kind of building codes that maybe would say, yeah, you'd have to have a space in between. It would increase the cost of fireproofing. I completely agree. I mean, there are other models of similar housing. Well, actually, I'd also say the stretches where it is completely continuous occur. There are places where it divides often, so it's also not just one continuous band, but actually. You see there are points where it splits fairly often. I can show it better here. So the resolution doesn't show it, but actually there are various places where it does split, and the idea between that was also you wouldn't develop this at once. In fact, you probably could only develop 50 units at once, and it would grow incrementally over time. So the fundamental unit was maybe a block of 50 houses. I do agree that there's probably fire issues, but within a scope of a thesis which had to begin with the history of the Gulf City, find all these housing typologies, propose a master plan for Muharram, fireproofing. By the way, yes, I completely agree. It's one of those things where it's like, yes, a make or break. But I think for me, it's way more important to make an articulate paradigmatic condition than say, okay, I offset the walls by a foot, therefore we don't have fire. I completely agree that it's important. It's just not within the scope of this exercise. It's it's hugely important.
Don't you think that Isa Town case is one of the cases that we should look back to it because it brings all Bahrainis from different backgrounds in one city and it's very successful. And even we have a term of model Medina and they have their own. So it's one of the most successful projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several reasons for that. I think all of the housing we've looked at, and that's the reason why I mentioned it, is I think all the housing cases in Bahrain are useful. And of course, varying degrees of success. Like you could say, well, there hasn't been enough growth around Hamad Town for it to have the success of Medina Thesis. And Medina Thesis, if you look at it in Google Maps now, you almost can't see where the initial parcels were and where the rest of the city is growing around it. I think Hamad Town has a lot of interesting successes too. I mean, when Hamad Town was built, they had these books that said, they built like a minimum house and said, here's how you expand your house in Hamad Town. So actually, which is, I may be mistaken, but I don't think it's been done since. Like the idea of expandable units in that same way as okay. So this actually used to be like a 200 slide presentation. I took out all these slides because, well, you saw. But let me, and I've got a piece of book. Let me pull it up. But basically, these books are fantastic. So I think all these different cases provide little lessons on successful strategies. There's little things in Zayed Town. Certain places do parks and recreation areas better. Certain places have better landscaping. For me, Isa Town is maybe it's the most successful one, but it also has had a lot more time. And Hamad Town, I think, as an idea, had a lot of successes, at least in the way it imagined what happens when you get a house. I'll pull it up, but let's take the next question. Any questions about that?
Yeah. I'm a bit skeptic about what you said, that all the models of the houses or all the housing projects in Bahrain have been successful.
No, I didn't say that. I said they're useful.
Useful. Is housing just to physically house people and families, or it has other dimensions? Here comes my question to your project. Where does the socio-cultural identities of Bahrainis fit with this project? I'll give an example just to explain what I'm trying to say here. In many of the new housing projects, we lost fundamental practices and rituals of our Bahraini culture. If you go to new housing project, families there no longer do garga'un, for instance. We Bahrainis, when we want to celebrate such rituals, we have to go to Old Firjan and celebrate them. Now with your model, how far, or to what extent it took into account our cultural, ethnic, and various issues of identities?
Right. First of all,
if I can add one more thing.
Please.
If you look at Bahraini towns and villages, there are certain characteristics for each Firij. You have Firij al-Bin Ali, which is based on tribal lineage. You have al-Haddad, for instance, or the rest who are based on craftsmanship. What does this project take on board?
That's a great question. Sorry, that's the Ministry of Housing book I mentioned. It's a great question. I'll first refer to the previous answer, which is ultimately the projects you talk about are the projects of modernity. I mean, not celebrating Garga'un happens in some places in Harrag because locals don't move there. It happens. I mean, it's hard to split these things from I moved to Beit Iskan and suddenly Masalli Dasha. I mean, I think these are larger cultural shifts that happen with
in future, we pay for it heavily.
Absolutely. I'm not disregarding the question.
Crime rate increasing because of the type of the housing that's being built.
By the way, I completely agree that it's an issue. I'm saying it's just, I'm prefacing my answer by saying it's hard to separate practices that you do because you want them as practices, or practices that you do because you have a one-story home. And I say this not because I don't believe it's important, but because it's hard to say, the Isa Town model was successful because we had a majlis, so that meant people gathered more. You can say, well, maybe you had a majlis, but actually people gathered less. Or in the case of Kuwait, you have this Diwani has sometimes a separate building, and so a lot of meetings happen there. So there's also, as kind of cities develop, it's hard to say, well, these practices were lost because of suburbanization, or because just modernization. And so I'd first say I have my opinion on the answer, but I can't say, for example, families not having lunch together is a problem of where we put the kitchen and not the problem of men and women having to work, which is it's the problem of capitalism.
That's why who designed the cities need to work with sociologists, with
Absolutely.
cultural specialists, with psychologists.
Absolutely.
You cannot just design a city
No. I mean,
not integrate it with the values of the community itself.
I sent you like 3 emails you didn't reply to. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I completely agree. I think, which actually, I think this is one of the points it tries to bring up, which is the discourse on cities and the way we imagine them has to occur on multiple levels, but it has to occur between all these disciplines. And I think it's sort of a project that I say to architects because I am one and I speak to a community of them, but I think it's something that we share even if you're not professional at all. I mean, it's a conversation that you're having by virtue of living here. As for how I looked into it, well, one, I think to me it's interesting to suggest a model apart, which is a model that has all the basic components but tries to do them in a different way, which in my case was imagining a majlis as a kind of unit that inhabits a ground floor, but that the entire ground floor is just a series of majlises. Maybe that provides some opportunities in the sense that suddenly there's a public ground space which you can move through. Suddenly you can imagine people setting up shops or little stores in a majlis and not needing a majlis. And I think also the nature of the unit was one that allowed many different alternatives and different configurations. That's why there's 4. So the kind of unit that imagines ultimately 3 rooms, which could be a man living by himself with a workstation and a room where people come in as interns. There is the desire to imagine different alternatives that's rooted in the relationship of a majlis to a house and keeping the fundamental essentials, and then also keeping the idea of the culture as through the courtyard, the idea of shared public space was also kind of a cultural theme. But I think ultimately, yes, the project tries to imagine certain Bahrainis and certain ways of living, but also doesn't ask about others, and I think that those questions are definitely ones that have to come up. I'll also say, there's other parts of Bahrain that are under research in this proposal that definitely need to be researched, which is more kind of village conditions, the conditions of more rural conditions. And I think, we hear a lot about Harag and Manama, but there's also a lot of other villages that have different spatial, cultural traditions and relationships to the land that I think are completely valid and provide interesting alternatives and have to be researched much more. And I think this didn't do it because somehow it has to also connect to the other non-rural countries in the Gulf. So it has to have something in common with the others. But Bahrain is unique in the sense that it has a rural component that Kuwait and others don't. That's its own body of research. Sorry for the long answer to the.
There is actually a proposal from Scam Bank and Ministry of Housing. They tried to do housing for rural and villager, and with the same strategy for urbanists, and it doesn't succeed because the community would like to live next to each other. Like in Meksha village, I don't know if you heard about it.
Meksha, you are Burger Land? Yeah.
Right. It's really. I think what I didn't get the whole thing that I think missing here is maybe you're starting defining the problem that you are tackling, because it's you get very general perspective of all things about housing, and maybe we should just narrow it to what you're interested in. And I believe that you cannot sort out everything in one solution. solutions for one thing, you know. So it's just you give it a try and see and test it. Regarding Medina Isa, I'm teaching housing library, so
Yeah.
I've designed housing for 3-4 years now. So and most of them are my student here, so maybe that's why I'm linking back to their designs proposals. We did actually, we analyzed housing in Medina Isa and Medina Hamad and all these affordable housings. I think you should be careful because I think you're more urbanist background. Yeah, you look into the biggest pictures of housings within the urban fabric of the city. I think that's what you're more interested in, more than I think also other than the microstructures, which is the generic forms of how this house has been evolved through Ministry of Housings and from the vernacular housings of Bahrain. So you can see, you'll see such a richness in the beginning of Medina Isa, especially of this creating small courtyard with a garden and kitchen facing. It's such a tiny house, but it's such a rich inequality of spaces and social relationships between the users. But that's, I think, either you present the global structure and the global phenomena, or you go to the micro phenomena and or link them together how this is impact. And I believe they both needed actually to develop these housing projects. So, but overall, I really enjoyed it. But I think there's such a gaps. I couldn't link why you end up with this and why this is the ideal. What is your criteria that you choose, or your ingredients or factors that is saying, okay, beside that conceptually approach of the courtyard. You've been inspired by this, but it's interesting. When I was wondering, okay, you did this housing, how is this related to commercial activity?
Right.
The neighborhood, where's the mosque? Where's I can buy my grocery 24 hours? Where's my laundry? Or I don't know, something like that, like the everyday's activities of neighborhoods. But it's a very nice proposal. I like this housing unit more than ever. The urban fabric still, I'm scared about it, but I think the solutions for these opening courtyards in the edge is quite beautiful and raising, keeping this as a public in the ground floor. I think it's quite really interesting. And it reminds me about Libya, vernacular cities have similar continuously public spaces in the ground floor. And so something is not, it's really, it is part of Islamic cities, but it's not well known in the Jesus or Andover.
Thanks so much. No. There's a few points I could respond to, but I've been meaning to talk to you too. So.
First of all, thanks again for your presentation. Your response to the socio-cultural question, I felt like you dropped the ball there a little bit. I think as translators of people's hopes, dreams, cultures, ideas, visions of the world into built form, there's a lot on us as architects. And I want to add to that, and something that you mentioned, which I thought was brilliant. You said that this project of housing was directly related to what it means to be Bahraini, what it means to be a modern Bahraini. And in essence, when you said that, in a way that contradicts with your response to that question, or let's say the lackluster response to that question, that when you say that, then the house contains so much cultural value. And where you place the kitchen in the house, and how much you cook, and all that, that does so much. You cannot imagine how bad it is to fry fish, safi, in an apartment. Simple as that.
Yeah.
So you don't do it. So that's an elemental Bahraini practice of frying safi that you will not do if you live in an apartment, because your whole place is going to smell. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think we can overestimate the cultural value and the societal and the socio-cultural value in any move we make, especially if it's on the scale of decades, of time and on the scale of, tens of square kilometers, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess fundamentally what I'm trying to say here is, there's a lot more room for us to take ownership. There's a lot more ownership that needs to kind of claim.
Mm-hmm.
And in response to the fireproofing question, I'll just add that was the excuse actually for setbacks, and in many ways the destruction of the courtyard house and the social fabric that it created. It's a problem that the Europeans had because they use wood primarily in construction, but not a problem that we necessarily had because of the construction material that we use. So it was a mistranslation of codes, in essence, in my humble opinion. Having said that,
Now, I apologize for the lackluster response. And I agree. I mean, there's plenty, and this is also follows up Dr. Rafa's point. I mean, I think there's lots of aspects of the thesis tackles and then chooses not to tackle. I think definitely there's one of the questions where it's when what happens if women want to meet, and there's also a difference between Majlis and Islam, Majlis for AIA. What if women want to meet in the Majlis that day? What if women just want to meet in that Majlis and it's on a public ground floor? Do they have to meet upstairs? I think there's plenty of questions that I could throw myself under the bus on this one. I think maybe in that case, Dr. Wafa's question is really, how does one within a span of a year tackle something like housing? Well, the problem with housing is you say everything, but then if you don't say something, then you've missed out everything. And I think that's one of those things where it's looking back at the thesis. I think there's some things it tackles with a particular aim and objective, and it understands what's at stake in that regard. There's things that haven't been mentioned. For example, really, I think as communities of architects, there's things that are at stake for us that aren't at stake for the average Bahraini. Meaning, I think as an architect, there's particular fascinations and other projects, like for example, saying, well, on an architectural level, what's our relationship architecturally to Hamad Makia, Al-Jadirji? Like, these are architectural problems that the average Bahraini doesn't need to worry about, but architects worry about for architects. And the reason I'm saying this isn't to have an elitist conversation, but to say there's aspects of the project that, yes, tackle extremely real and pragmatic problems and have to define what it means to be in love as a Bahraini in the 21st century. But then there's also things that a project in a year can tackle. And so as I look back, I say, yes, maybe there's certain things that haven't been touched upon. But I think there's other things in a year I really wish I tackled more. Like I wish I wrote more about Gita. But a year goes by really quickly.
Ali, I'd like to just pick up on the point you said this is a vision.
Well, maybe do the two questions and I'll answer them both at the same
sorry.
time.
Okay. I'll just say that I welcome the fact you're saying you're having a vision to open an open discourse about this, because whatever way you go on this, you're talking about social engineering. Wherever you go, you can't solve it in one thing. But the point is, without the discourse and how we put people physically onto the earth and house them, then the opportunity is missed, because it then just turns into a numbers game. How many have you built?
Right.
And when it's down to that, it fails, no matter how
Exactly.
the size of the houses.
The reason I bring up the 60,000 units is, and the 60,000 unit slide came right before the people slide, which is, ultimately, the journey is, you think, okay, well, does the journey to 60,000 units mean that 240,000 Bahrainis will stop protesting? I mean, it's really, what's a unit? Is the unit the family, the unit the person? So I agree with you in that regard that, yeah, it's there's also a level of coaxing the problem away by making it a problem of units on a wait list. And that's also another completely different discussion, right? The way we understand the wait list. Who qualifies, when do they qualify? There's a whole piece of the research which is, I think, 30 to 50% of Bahraini government employees qualify, so a lot of people actually do qualify. It's only on the single, on like male, well, one person family has to be making 900 BD. I mean, there's all these questions of who qualifies, and then the wait list itself is 60,000 units, really, but who, and do they qualify on the, I mean, there's a whole mess of issues that just the units as a problem is, you could write a thesis on just what it means to have 63,000 units that you need to build and the fundamental kind of contradiction that embodies. not to mention the one you brought up.
We'll take the last question.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you
then
very
if anyone
much.
has any more questions, please feel free to.
Yeah, by the way, I mentioned it earlier. There's a bunch of postcards. I'm also here. I'm relatively friendly, so please feel free to come up and talk. I'm much nicer in person than with a microphone.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. I kind of agree that thinking about one housing model as an optimal solution for everybody that is not qualified. How I was just speculating that a lot of times housing models are considered more of an interventionist approach rather than an engagement approach. So, I'm just thinking that maybe it could have more implications in terms of policy, that you try to develop a framework for a housing model rather than have just one archetype that addresses all.
Absolutely.
It's just
In one of the earlier versions of the proposal, it was in fact just a 12 by 12 meter plot that you had to develop. And it was a series of rules on setbacks, how much you had to occupy from the ground, how much light you had to do. And I think it's sort of the answer to Lari's question, which is, I think, ultimately as an architect, there's questions that are like inextricably policy-based that can only be answered through policy, meaning like how you do a mortgage for a government-funded house, so that way Bahrainis can resort more to loans and the private market rather than the private mortgage market rather than the government. But as an architect, there are things that you're like, I could write this building code, but it's so unengaged. It's important. Someone should do it. But I think it's one of those debates where I was like, I'd much rather try 4 units, and I think there's maybe 30 units that really should be done. But imagine a whole mess of cases, a lot of different arches that need to be tried. But for the purposes of thesis that had to be explained in an hour, or in the case of the US 30 minutes, you kind of have to make people aware of why it's important to talk about the Middle East, and then also have to quickly jump into the scale of why an arch and not. You have to sort of cover all these bases in 30 minutes, and it's extremely hard to summarize those things quickly too. But your points are completely valid.
Great. Hey, everyone, please join me in thanking Ali Karimi.
Thank you guys for being here.